Hello, and welcome to another episode of Moore DEI Discussions, a series of conversations with C-suite executives who share their candid insight into many of the important aspects of creating and advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion principles and practices in their organizations. I am Marlon Moore, president of Marlon Moore Consulting, and thank you for joining us. Today, I am pleased to be joined by my good friend Bob Carter, chairman of Carter, which advances philanthropy worldwide by counseling nonprofit organizations in the area of fundraising, organizational planning, and governance. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome Bob Carter to Moore DEI Discussions. How are you, Bob?
I'm well. Thanks, Marlon. Glad to be here.
Good. Glad you could take time to join us today. Bob, how about you tell us just a little bit more about Carter?
Sure. I'll tell you the history of Carter is that basically when I left the Omnicom group, I won't necessarily reveal my age, but I was retirement qualified. And
Okay.
And fundamentally, I was retired for 10 weeks and it didn't work very well. And in order to preserve my marriage, I decided to start another business. And that's how this got started. I talked to some of my colleagues in New York and other places and just started a small private practice with 3 clients and a part-time assistant. And today, fast forward 11 years later, and we have over 50 consultants. We're working in 8 countries. And I'm chair, but I also have a great CEO, Steve Higgins, who really runs the day-to-day of the company. One of the differences with our company is that we don't just raise money in the United States to send to those countries, but we actually help raise money in those countries,
Right.
which is a big kind of critical difference. We do custom design work. Our campaigns, a lot of it's centered around either capital or endowment campaigns or combines of those 2 areas, and they range anywhere from 5 million to the largest one we're doing right now is 1.5 billion. It's one of those things where the diversity of our client base keeps it very interesting for our consultants as well as for me personally to see us work in all these different fields. And what we learn in one area helps us be better in another area.
Mm-hmm.
And that combination seems to work well. We're based in Vero Beach, Florida. I live in Sarasota, Florida, but we have consultants who live all over the U.S. and outside the U.S. also. That's kind of who we are. It's a very good 10 or 11 year story in terms of the growth of the company, but I think it's based on sound principles and ethical work. So I think it's going to last a little while.
That's great, Bob. Thank you for sharing that. And smart move with focusing on your marriage and doing the things that keep your household happy.
Yeah.
But I really appreciate you sharing that context about your reach, whether it's domestically or internationally. Why is diversity, equity, and inclusion important to you specifically?
Well, I've always, I was the president of Ketchum, that larger company, for a long time, for about 13 years. And, and at that time, and we're going back into in the 90s and 80s and so on. And it was abundantly clear that there was a big difference in not only the presence of fundraisers of color and of who didn't look like me, but there was a real inequity in terms of the capacity of institutions who those individuals represented having access to dollars. And it was very clear. And early on in my time at Ketchum, we became one of the first Northeastern fundraising companies, large companies, to work with HBCUs. And my early work at Fisk University is something I'm really proud of. And I went on to work with about 9 other HBCUs, and being able to bring that funding to another level. The egalitarian part of this country's philosophy and my personal philosophy have much to do with everyone playing on a level field. And I saw that that really wasn't going to happen. And early on, Marlon, I was told that, what are you doing working in the African American community, because there's not a lot of money there, fundraising money. And I said, well, let's follow it. There's a reason why there might not be. And secondly, I was told that community was not very philanthropic. And, in America, we tend to measure philanthropy by cash. Working around the world and understanding this, philanthropy is measured in many other ways. And what I discovered in the early years of working in the African American community and other agencies beyond higher education was that it was a very philanthropic culture, because people took care of each other. Their love of fellow man was evidenced every day because they fed their neighbors. And what I also discovered was much philanthropy happened between the church and fraternal orders. And that was the access for fundraising in that community. If I wanted anything to be successful, I had to have someone in the pulpit, and I had to have someone in one of the sorority or fraternity organizations who would endorse this, and then it would go forward, and people were very generous, etc. And having lived through that, and then the CASE organization, Council for Advancement and Support of Education, put together something called a minority forum. And I was one of the first speakers in that group back in the 80s. And we made real progress in bringing together, anywhere from 30 to 40 people of color who got better training and got focused training and intentional training, and in some cases better placement for positions than they might have had otherwise. And some of this, frankly, Marlon, comes from my background. I grew up in a very small town in Elkridge, Maryland, and I tell people we were too poor to be prejudiced. Everybody in that community had to do their job, and everybody sort of leaned in on a problem. If it was a community problem, didn't matter what color you are or where you live, but we all had to make it happen. And I learned that from my parents and grandparents who were very close to the African American community there. And my grandfather in particular, because he was an amateur boxer, and most of his buddies were African American boxers. So I saw this happening there just as a little kid. So it's always been something that's been in the front of my mind on how we do a better job of that.
I appreciate your personal perspective, your upbringing, and how that has influenced and shaped your point of view, as well as your previous work experience. It sounds like you were at an organization who was getting out in front of this work, especially with historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, which I'm proud to be a graduate of one, Virginia State University. And
I worked there.
Russell, look at that connection. So thank you for your work at VSU, because it helped produce Dr. Marlon Moore.
There we go. Good.
Good. Very much appreciate that. But you touched on something, Bob, that I want to go back to, because I recently read an article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And I'm going to quote the article here. It says, leaders of color have inequitable access to social networks that enable connections to the philanthropic community. Any thoughts about that point of view?
I think that's pretty much what I was talking about, because we all I call it spheres of influence. We all have a sphere that's around us, and if you look around, who's in it? Well, the majority of the time you look at it as people like you, people who look like you, act like you, whatever it might be. And where is your circle? Well, your circle may be in an area where you are getting exposed to others who have resources, et cetera. And so there's a lack of diversity in those levels of socializing, if you will, to make that kind of a connection happen. And what happens is then the organizations who don't have people or board members in those circles, they have to work much harder to get into that relationship, because in a sense it's an abnormal thing, because somebody who's already in that circle ask for an appointment and they get it because they know them.
Yeah, so I would imagine, Bob, that's kind of a two-way interaction, right? So you have those who are in charge of distributing dollars, but then those who are leaders of organizations have to do their part as well. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, it works on both sides of the
Yeah.
equation.
What do you see as the board's role in ensuring that our organization kind of lives up to this strategic imperative?
Well, it's always interesting that, excuse me, take a look at the board and then take a look at the service area or the community in which it works.
That's right.
And you say, okay, what does this look like? Is there any
Right.
parity between those two? And
Right.
historically, that's been a big no in most cases. And it's like, how do you know what's the way you ought to be making certain decisions if you don't have that voice in the room?
That's right.
And in many cases, it's all you need is the voice. You need it at the table. It doesn't mean you're flipping a board 100% or anything like that, but you must have voice and you must have that kind of representation. I think they're doing a much better job today than they ever have, but there's plenty of room to grow with boards.
Yeah. Yeah, and I appreciate that. I'm actually a part of a board here in Central Ohio, United Way of Central Ohio, so shout out to them, that is actually requesting the board demographic of organizations they fund. And that's largely in part to ensure, to your point, Bob, that the boards reflect the communities where the dollars are going. And so it's really great to see that occur. But then also, I think it's important for boards to hold organizational leaders accountable for coming up with plans specific to this work and making sure that they're executing against those. What would you share with me as some best practices for fundraising as a new nonprofit or even tenured nonprofit? But I'm sure that matters. But I got to learn from the expert. How can I go out and raise some dollars, Bob?
Like so many things I say, it starts with the board.
Yeah.
So you need to assemble a group of people who have certain, I call them qualifications. Number one, they must be passionate about the cause.
Okay.
So they've got to be believers themselves, because one of their very important roles is advocacy. They have to be willing to tell their sphere of influence and others how great this mission is and why we're carrying this out. And they have to develop their own story. They have to be able to tell another person why they're there, why they made that decision. And that's a principle of fundraising. Fundraising is nothing but storytelling. We tell the story of the institution, and then I tell my story about why it's important to me, and then I invite someone else to invest in it just like I have. And the other qualification is that they have to have wisdom. They're bringing something to the table to help you in your fundraising or in your programmatic support. And the other part of it is working. There have to be people who are willing to work. One of the mistakes that's made early on sometimes is people get, they get names, and they have half a dozen really good names in the community, but they're not going to do anything. They haven't committed to it. They just kind of sound good and look good. I'd rather just have the endorsement. I don't want to put them on my board and have them help me as an endorser, et cetera. But building that leadership group that cares deeply about what you're doing and is willing to do the early hard work to develop resources for you with their reach into the community, into the national, local, regional community, wherever it might be. That's going to be critical, because they become, as a founder, let's pretend like you're the CEO, they're going to be your partners, basically.
I guess as we kind of round out our conversation, and you've touched on so much today, what parting advice would you leave organizational leaders? You mentioned earlier, this is a journey, right? So what parting advice would you leave for organizational leaders who want to do better in the DEI space?
Yeah, I would say this. There are a couple pieces of this. One is you must be intentional about it. And you have to develop your plan for your agency and your culture on how this will work. You can't look over your shoulder at another agency and say, okay, we're going to do that.
Sure.
You got to do the hard work, which is inside, and develop a plan that's going to make sense for your agency. So that's number one. The other part of it is recognize that it's not going to be all peaches and cream, and understand that. And if you are making an intentional move to bring in more diversity, equity, inclusion into the room, do it in numbers that make sense. Don't bring one representative in and say, okay, here we go. Because number one, that's an awfully uncomfortable position for that person. So I would say try to bring a class in that is more diverse and another class following it and so on. Do it over a period of 3 to 5 years and develop a plan along those lines. Because very often some really good people get invited onto the board. They look around the room and say, well, I'm it. And that's a very lonely feeling for a lot of people. Doesn't bother some people, but it's kind of lonely. The other part of advice, the third piece I'll give is today, all leadership has to be adaptive. Make sure that your CEO, as well as your senior leadership, your board, all have an understanding of what adaptive leadership is. And look for answers in some places where you never had to look before. So that's part of that's asking yourselves the right questions and then listening to others from the outside.
I don't want to talk too much over that because I think that's a great place to leave it. Adaptive leadership leads to inclusion. I think is a great message. So Bob, thank you so much. This has been phenomenal. Thank you for your many contributions to this work. Your continued voice and leadership matters to many communities as we ensure equity on both the board level, on a philanthropic level, and in society in general. Thank you for listening. Marlin Moore Consulting is a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy development firm, helping organizations build their diversity strategy by providing them with resources to support their execution. For more information, visit marlinmore.com. And remember, diversity starts with you.